Okay, I thought I would pick up where I left off as far as the Psalms are concerned. The last time I spoke on Psalm 25, and I pointed out how Psalm 25 is divided up in three different sections, where the first 7 verses, I believe, is a very personal conversation between David and God. And then I pointed out how the next verses, from verses 8 through 15, spoke of God, but to us, because we, like David, who was king of Israel at that time, we are destined to be kings as well. So he was talking to us, the kings that would come after him. And then it goes back after verse 15 to starting in verse 16. It goes back to being an intimate, prayer-like conversation between David and God, and how beautiful that was. So when we go into Psalm 26 in the New King James also calls it a prayer. As a matter of fact, the subtitle in the New King James says, "A prayer for divine scrutiny and redemption." And I like to look, when I read it, it looked like it was more than just that. There is also a test element to it, where as we read it, we're going to see how David is asking something very special of God. And like I said, it's more than just a prayer, but it's also a request from David. Now, picture, if you will, I think that he did this particular psalm before he was crowned, before he was coronated. But I also think that he did this after he killed Goliath. And in those in-between years, he went through a lot of turmoil, especially since he had Saul looking to eliminate him, but David, he had a respect for Saul. I mean, after all, while Saul lived, Saul was God's anointed, and he was not going to lift his hand against him. But he had his opportunities, didn't he? If you know the story. Well, anyway, let's get right into it. In verse 1, in the New King James, it reads, "Vindicate me, O Lord." In the Old King James, it uses the term "judge me," which pretty much grabs me better. "For I have walked in my integrity." And the word integrity can also mean here innocently. I have walked innocently. It could also mean perfectly. I have walked perfectly. And it could also mean uprightly. I have walked uprightly. Now, not for nothing, in a way, David sounds a little boisterous here, but I don't think that's the case at all, because he goes, in continuing in verse 1, he states, "I have also trusted in the Lord." So the Lord was basically his walking stick to walk, with integrity. And it also says, "I shall not slip." And how true is that? Because David, at that time, again, this is before his coronation as king. At that time, David did not slide into his own self-gratification of how good he was. He didn't do that. He was a humble man. Remember how he spoke up until the point he killed Goliath, how Goliath was mocking the Israelites, and yet out of the crowd of Israelite soldiers comes a boy with a sling. I can only imagine how Goliath must have felt when he saw him come out of the crowd. He must have felt insulted that a boy came up against him. But David walked with God, and he continued to walk with God. Later on, yes, he did slip up, but then he came right back, and he never left him after that. He put his complete trust in God in all that he did at that time. Then it continues in verse 2. "Examine me, O Lord, and prove me. Here David wants the great God to investigate him, to look him over, to point out where he might be lacking so that David can address that and turn it around. And then he continues in verse 2. It says, try my mind and my heart. In the old King James, it uses the term reins. You know, the reins that you use to control an animal, like the horse. You know, you pull on the left to go left, you pull on the right to go right, you pull both to stop. I think that's a better translation there in the old King James. The reins. David wanted God to see. He wanted God to see just what it was that guided his mind and controlled his heart. As a matter of fact, David tells us in Psalm 119. In Psalm 119, verse 97, he tells us. He says, oh, how I love your law, your heart. He loved his law. And then it continues, it is my meditation all the day. Yes. His mind. Yes, David was a real firecracker in those days. He lived for God. And again, this is before his coronation as king. David indeed walked with integrity. Absolutely. He walked with God's commandments on his mind and love for those commandments in his heart. David was confident that his heart and his motives were right, and he was not afraid of God's examination. Nor should we. Nor should we, if we're following that standard. He had kept the love of God and of man in his heart. He had walked in the path of righteousness that God had placed before him. Even though that path at times seemed dark and dangerous and even potentially deadly. But obviously when he went up against Goliath, he had no fear because God was with him. He knew that God was with him. In verse 3, for your loving kindness is before my eyes, and I have walked in your truth. Walking in God's truth is walking with integrity. Verse 4, I have not sat with idolatrous mortals, nor will I go in with hypocrites. Verse 5, I have hated the assembly of evil doers and will not sit with the wicked. David saw fit to keep away from those who would lift his heart in pride with their vain praise of how he does things. You know, he didn't let it go to his head. He would not listen to the words of men who would try to encourage him to do evil. Remember what I said before about Saul? He had his opportunity to kill him, to get him out of the way. But no, he didn't take matters into his own hand. Unlike some of the other prominent people of the Bible. For example, take Abraham, for example. He lied about the identity of his wife by calling her his sister. He feared man more than he feared God at that moment. How about Sarah and what she did? She was told by God that she would have a son, the son of promise. But what did she do? She took matters into her own hands and had Hagar, her handmaiden, provide a son to both her, who she mistakenly thought, and her husband Abraham. And all that did was cause troubles that lasted centuries between the two sons of Abraham. And how about the wife of the son of promise, Rebekah. And what she did, she was told that the second-born son would be the one to receive the birthright blessing. All she had to do was what David did, waiting for his crown. Just wait. Wait, let God bring it to fruition. But no, she took matters into her own hands, and she deceived her and took advantage of her blind husband. And Jacob, her son, went along with it. And then that also caused a rift between those two brothers. You know, David, imagine if David would have done what they did, take matters into his own hands, and he would have killed Saul. Most likely that would have enraged the Benjamites to break away from the Israelite Union, and maybe their allied tribes as well. We don't know, but that could have happened. But David knew better. He knew that God had told him that he was going to be the next king. All he had to do was wait, and David did exactly that. He had patience on the Lord. He would not listen to those voices that would bring war, that would bring strife, and that would bring disunity in the congregation of Israel. David had asked God to test his motives, to test his heart. He said in verse 2, he said, try my mind and my heart. That was his statement to God, remember? So I have a question, brethren. Are you willing to let God try your mind? Control the reins of your life? I'm glad to hear that. Are you willing to allow God to steer you in the right direction? Because I tell you, God is surely going to test that steering. Whether you want to or not, he's going to do it because he chose you. You accepted that calling. He wants to make sure that you are doing everything in your part to be in his kingdom. He will try you and allow you to face some great, great obstacles in this chemical existence that we call life. He's going to place huge potholes in front of you just to see how you handle it. He wants to see what is steering your heart and mind if it's not him. Now there is one thing I want all of you to remember, brethren, is that God will never lead you away from the right path. He will never, ever do that. No, not at all. God will never lead you wrong, and the paths of righteousness and peace are always going to be your destination, just as long as God is leading you. Now, starting in verse 6, this is where it becomes more and more like a prayer between David to God. And in there, it starts off with, he says, I will wash my hands in innocence, so I will go out about your altar, O Lord. And then in verse 7, that I may proclaim with the voice of thanksgiving and tell of all your wondrous works. And in verse 8, Lord, I have loved the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. Verse 9, do not gather my soul with sinners, nor my life with bloodthirsty men. And in verse 10, in whose hands is a sinister scheme, and whose right hand is full of bribes. That sounds an awful lot like corruption. Verse 11, but as for me, I will walk in my integrity. I will walk uprightly. I will walk perfectly. Then he says, redeem me and be merciful to me. Now let's stop here just for a moment before we get to the end here and ask this question. Why was David so eager to have God examine him? Well, the Apostle Paul gives us the reason why. In 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 28, 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 28, it says, "But let a man examine himself." Obviously, this is what David did. And then you drop down to verse 31. It says, "For if we judge ourselves, we will not be judged." That's how sure David was, asking for God to examine him. And in 2 Corinthians 13, in verse 5, 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5, it states, Paul writes, "Examine yourselves as to whether you are in the faith." And then he says, "Test yourselves." So obviously, David did exactly that during those years between Goliath and his crown. He did that. And with that said, let's finish off that psalm with the very last verse, verse 12. "My foot stands in an even place." In other words, his mind is right. "In the congregations, I will bless the Lord." With that said, amen and happy Sabbath, brethren.